What exactly is HEOR? That's the question I'm trying to answer in today's video. HEOR, or Health Economics and Outcomes Research, is a highly complex field, which includes a lot of different subdisciplines and methodologies, which can be difficult to put into context. Since I'm a visual learner, I was thinking about ways of how I can condense my many years of experience of working as a health economist into a format that is visually appealing. That's why I created a simple mind map about HEOR, as you can see here, that covers the key concepts used in this field. As there are a lot of important concepts to be aware of in HEOR, I won't be able to explain all of them in detail here. Rather, this video should act as a starting point for those of you who want to get a general overview of the field. Some of these topics I've already covered in separate, more detailed videos, so keep an eye out for the links that will pop up in the top right corner of this video. Let's start off by going down the yellow branch, which brings us to the first node that covers the goals that we're aiming to achieve in HEOR. In the field of health economics and outcomes research, we generally try to do three things. We want to inform healthcare decision-making. We want to optimize the way in which limited resources are allocated. And lastly, we want to support value-based healthcare. With these goals in mind, let us explore the blue branch, which takes us to health economics, which makes up one of the two major components of HEOR. From here, you can see that the mind map spreads out into several branches and subnodes. To bring some clarity to this mess, let's first look at the different types of health economics studies. As you can see, common study types include cost minimization studies, cost of illness studies, and cost consequence analysis. All these studies focus on capturing costs, with CMAs being used in cases where two interventions have equivalent effectiveness or outcomes, and the only goal is to determine the least costly option. A CCA, on the other hand, is a method of health economic evaluation in which all costs, both direct and indirect, and a catalogue of different consequences of all alternatives are computed and then listed separately without aggregating these results into one single metric. Most widely known among the health economic study types that assess costs are budget impact studies, which I'll cover in a bit more detail shortly. Then we also have three very similar but still different study types, namely cost-benefit, cost-effectiveness, and cost-utility analysis. As you can see from the dotted lines, I'll speak more about these study types shortly, as they're so essential for health economics. And lastly, pharmacoeconomic studies represent a broad umbrella term covering studies that evaluate the costs and effects of a pharmaceutical product. Let us follow the dotted lines to understand some of the important concepts for cost effectiveness and cost utility analysis. To determine the cost effectiveness, health economists will build a cost effectiveness model, and there are many different types to choose from, such as Markov models, partition survival models, decision tree models, and more. If you're unsure about which of these models is best for your research question, you can check out my video on the subject, which should pop up on screen now, where I walk you through how these models work and what's right for you. Such cost effectiveness models are typically built in Microsoft Excel, but they can be also developed in software like R or dedicated modeling software such as Triage. Next up, let's have a look at the outcomes that are commonly used for cost effectiveness modeling. Generally, there's two main outcomes that you should know about: the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or ICER for short, and the net monetary benefit. ICERs tend to use incremental costs and QALYs to make reimbursement recommendations, but you could also use live years gained and even DALYs avoided. The ICER and net monetary benefit always need to be seen in the context of a willingness to pay threshold, which represents the maximum amount a society or healthcare system is willing to pay for a unit of health benefit, such as QALY or a life year gained. In England, for example, the willingness to pay threshold set by NICE for a single technology appraisal is a range between £20,000 and £30,000. However, there's exceptions to this rule as well, as the threshold is different for highly specialized technology appraisals, for example. On top of that, the willingness to pay can be affected by what's known as the severity modifier, which has different implementation in cost-effectiveness markets like the Netherlands, Norway, or England, for example. Lastly, willingness to pay is often visualized graphically in cost-effectiveness analysis using plots like the cost-effectiveness plane or the SIAC. Moving on to the next node, we need to talk about sensitivity analysis. In health economics, nothing is certain. In the absence of perfect data, we frequently must make many assumptions, which creates uncertainty. To better understand this uncertainty, health economists conduct sensitivity analysis, including scenario analysis, DSA and PSA, and in very rare cases, analysis such as EVPI. Zooming out again for a second, we see that the CA branch of our mind map has many different nodes, which again goes to show how important this topic is in HEOR. As I've alluded to earlier, budget impact analysis, or BIA, is another key concept in HEOR, so let's focus on that for a second. Budget impact refers to the total cost a healthcare intervention will add to a healthcare budget over a specific period, usually set to either 3 or 5 years. It answers the question, how much will this new intervention cost the healthcare system in total? In other words, budget impact models try to compare a world with the new intervention against a world without the new intervention, to see how the introduction of this new intervention will affect the healthcare budgets. BIA outcome types include incremental BI, usually expressed as PMPM or PTMPM, as well as market share and uptake assumptions that usually leverage an epidemiological cascade to derive the target patient population numbers. Related to budget impact analysis, many countries across the globe have thresholds in place that trigger additional scrutiny or conditions, such as the budget impact test in England or the gross revenue threshold for orphan drugs in Germany. Jumping to the second last node in our health economics part of our mind map, I've included utility elicitation, which has crossover into the outcomes research node that we're going to look at in a bit. Standard gamble, time trade-off, and the VAS are all tools we use to understand how patients value health outcomes, which is crucial if we want to do cost-effectiveness analysis. To close out the health economics section, we should briefly touch on data sources that economists use to run their analysis. Standard data sources include clinical trial data, RWE, electronic health records, and health insurance claims data. Now that we've got a better idea about health economics, let us focus our attention on the second component that makes up HEOR by following the turquoise branch. To put it simply, outcomes research can be broken down into 3 major areas, including clinical outcomes, patient-reported outcomes, and economic outcomes. Let us start from the top and look at clinical outcomes first. One of the most important clinical outcomes is mortality, generally measured as overall survival. If you can demonstrate that patients who are receiving an intervention are dying significantly less often than patients not receiving the intervention, you've got good reason to believe that your treatment works. Apart from OS, clinical trials will often measure so-called morbidity outcomes, focusing on measuring the impact of a treatment on patients' health and quality of life, often assessing how a disease affects daily functioning and well-being. Another clinical outcome that is closely related to morbidity but still distinct is quality of life, which can be further broken down into health-related quality of life and symptom burden. QOL outcomes tend to be broader than morbidity outcomes, attempting to measure a person's overall well-being, whereby morbidity outcomes try to capture the impact of a disease more specifically. There's many more clinical outcomes, as you can see from the mind map, such as functional outcomes, response rates, adverse events, and time to event outcomes, which I'm not going to cover in more detail here. I want to take a brief moment though to speak about biomarker and surrogate outcomes, as they're used so commonly in modern medicine to prove the effectiveness of a new drug treatment. In essence, surrogate outcomes are used as an indicator or sign in place of another hard, quantifiable long-term outcome. In diabetes drug trials, for example, it would be very difficult and costly to directly measure if a patient develops cardiovascular disease as a result of their diabetes, as it usually takes patients a long time to develop such complications. That's why surrogate outcomes such as HbA1c are used in diabetes management to predict the potential long-term outcomes related to diabetes without having to wait until those events actually happen. Jumping to the last subnode of our clinical outcomes, trials may also measure healthcare resource utilization outcomes, which overlaps with the economic outcomes, which I'll discuss shortly. Before we look at economic outcomes, we should follow the path down to the patient-reported outcomes, or PROs. As you can see, there's many different types of PROs, such as health-related quality of life, symptom scales, or satisfaction with treatment. Taking a closer look at QOL measurement methods, we can further differentiate 3 QOL instruments, including generic, disease-specific, and utility-based instruments. Examples for generic instruments include the EQ5D or SF36, whereby disease-specific instruments focus on a particular disease, such as the EORTC for cancer, for example. The last important subnote in this part of the mind map is the concept of minimal clinically important difference, or MCID. In this context, the MCID is the smallest change in a treatment outcome that an individual patient would identify as important and which would indicate a change in the patient's management, which is essential for QOL measurement. Coming over to our next note, economic outcomes represents the last big bucket of outcomes collected within HEOR. As you can see, economic outcomes can be split into direct and indirect costs. Direct costs include costs such as drug acquisition costs, hospitalization costs, or costs for diagnostic tests. These costs all refer to the expenses directly associated with the diagnosis, treatment, and management of a disease or health condition. In contrast to this, indirect costs refer to the costs that are not directly tied to medical care, but arise as a consequence of a disease or health condition, such as productivity loss or caregiver costs. If we zoom out again for a second, you can see that even though we've covered the 2 major elements of HEOR, there's still 4 other major branches left to discuss in our HEOR mind map. These 4 branches cover supportive concepts relevant to HEOR, which I thought I couldn't skip when talking about HEOR. The first of these supportive concepts is research methods, represented via the purple node here. If we climb up the top branch, we get to the systematic literature review node. As the medical literature is constantly growing, a key research skill to have in HEOR is to be able to conduct SLRs to make sense of the vast body of academic papers and publications. I've already made a video in which I break down the step-by-step process you can take to conduct your next SLR, so check that video out in case you're interested. With the uprise of AI in recent years, artificial intelligence has now found its way into HEOR as well, especially in the context of SLRs, where it is used to accelerate the traditional labor-intensive process. Closely related to SLRs is the concept of meta-analysis, which health economists use to summarize the results of multiple studies in a field. As you can see from the mind map, you can choose from a variety of methods to conduct a meta-analysis, for example by using traditional fixed or random effects methods, indirect treatment comparisons or ITC methods, such as the Bucher method, network meta-analysis, or even matching adjusted indirect comparisons. When we go down the research methods node, you can see that I've included statistics as a key competency in HEOR. I can't highlight enough how important statistics are for health economists, which is why I made a video about how every health economist should master the art of statistics, talking about the famous book called The Art of Statistics by David Spiegelhalter. I've divided the statistics node into basic and advanced methods, with a separate node for most used methods. This, of course, isn't a complete list, but I believe that at a minimum, health economists should have a general understanding about different outcome types and scales, descriptive statistics, such as measures of central tendency, as well as inferential statistics like hypothesis testing, p-values, and confidence intervals. In terms of the more advanced statistical methods, it's beneficial to be familiar with propensity score matching, Bayesian analysis, generalized linear models, and Monte Carlo simulations. Lastly, time-to-event analysis is a key technique often used in HEOR, given that we're constantly dealing with survival analysis and Kaplan-Meier curves where data needs to be extrapolated. If we move down a bit, you can see that the last topic I've included in my research methods section for the HEOR mind map is study design. Study design can be split into interventional and observational study design, and there are several subtypes for each. Every study type comes with its own pros and cons, which are good to know about if you want to use data from one of these studies in your research. Let's zoom out again and move to our next major node in our HEOR mind map. I gave medical writing its own place on the HEOR mind map, as I believe it is such an important element, given that none of our health economic models and outcomes research studies that we're working on are worth a dime if we can't communicate their results effectively. I find it so important, in fact, that I've already put out a video in which I share 6 tips of how to become a better medical writer, which I'll blend in on screen for you right now. The way I've broken down this section is by the types of medical writing you can do. First up is dossier writing. If you're writing a dossier, it's either a global value dossier or GVD or a local submission document, which is required for local HTA submissions. Examples of local submission dossiers include the AMNOG dossiers in Germany or the AMCP dossier in the US. If you're not writing a dossier, you may be working on a HEOR manuscript instead. By manuscript, I mean you either work on a peer-reviewed journal article for submission to high-impact HEOR journals like Value in Health, Pharma Economics, or the Journal of Health Economics, or conference posters for big industry conference like ISPOR, or just simple white papers and policy documents. Alternatively, you could also work on a report for a major deliverable like a CEM, BIM, or PRO study, which is what I've labeled report writing, as you can see here. Last but not least, I've included slide decks for advisory boards with the key opinion leaders in a field or payer value proposition materials as a subtype of medical writing. If we take a look again at the wider context of the HEOR mind map, you can see that one aspect we haven't covered so far is the stakeholders which are involved in the HEOR space. I wanted to look at HEOR stakeholders separately, as this provides a great opportunity to provide an overview of potential employers for people interested in a job in HEOR. So let's walk through them one by one. First up, we've got HTA agencies. Many countries around the world conduct health technology assessments, and institutions like NICE, EQUIC, or PBAC all employ HEOR experts to facilitate these assessments. Then we've got payers. Generally speaking, this is where the money comes from. In England, the NHS acts as the national payer. In Germany, the national payer is the statutory health insurance, or GKV-SV, and in the US, payers can be split into private and public insurance companies, whereby the latter covers many individuals via programs such as Medicare or Medicaid. Before payers get involved, new drugs first need regulatory approval, which they get through organizations like the FDA in the US or the EMA in Europe. While regulatory affairs is its own field, it's still relevant to HEOR, given that receiving marketing authorization is a key step that leads to drug reimbursement. Next up on the list of key stakeholders, we've got pharmaceutical companies. Unsurprisingly, pharma companies hire HEOR folk to determine cost effectiveness and set prices for their new drugs. Those new drugs that pharma companies develop eventually land in the hands of patients, which is why it's important as well that the patient voice is heard loud and clear in the HEOR space. Patient organizations articulate this patient voice and provide useful information to patients while also becoming an increasingly more important stakeholder in the HTA process. Another major stakeholder in HEOR are consultancies. Big names in pharma consulting include firms like IQVIA, MedPace, or Syneos Health, and pharma companies will often contract with such consultancies to get their work done. If you are considering getting into HEOR, consultancies can be a great gateway into the industry, so check out my beginner's guide to pharma consulting if that sounds interesting to you. There are various other stakeholders that play a role in HEOR. NGOs, academia, hospitals, and key opinion leaders all influence HEOR by contributing towards research priorities, generating real-world evidence, validating methodologies, and advocating for the relevance of outcomes that matter most to patients and society. I'm sure you could list more stakeholders that contribute to HEOR, but I'm going to stop here and move on to my last topic. Following along the red branch of our HEOR mind map, you can see that I've included market access as a key element of HEOR. The goal of market access is to ensure that new healthcare products such as drugs, devices, or diagnostics are made available to patients by securing favorable reimbursement and establishing broad payer acceptance, while also demonstrating value in terms of clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and patient outcomes. Market access is a great field for HEOR experts to work in, given that market access is responsible for overseeing the health technology assessment process, which again heavily relies on cost effectiveness methods like CEA and cost utility analysis. Thereby, drug pricing lies at the very core of market access, giving that value-driven pricing will facilitate reimbursement while also ensuring broad patient access. The price of a new medicine is undoubtedly one of the largest factors for reimbursement, which is why people working in HEOR need to be aware of things like managed entry agreements, patient access schemes, and simple negotiation strategy. Lastly, market access can also be broken down by geographical scope, namely into regional, national, and global market access. Regional market access usually starts once national reimbursement has been achieved, while global market access usually refers to functions working on deliverables such as GVDs and global cost-effectiveness models, which then get rolled out to country affiliates of a pharmaceutical company. When we zoom out again and look at the entire mind map for HEOR, you can see that it looks a bit like chaos cartography or the mind maze of mayhem, but I do genuinely believe that all of these concepts I've included in today's video are highly relevant for HEOR experts. And I've probably even missed talking about several other concepts that would have deserved a spot on this mind map. Hopefully though, this mind map has helped you understand HEOR a little bit better. If you like this kind of content, then check out one of my other videos and don't forget to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.